Welcome to the eighth session in our series, our Miami Urban Studies series, Miami, Do You Love Me? This session is entitled Cuban Miami, and it's part of two of sessions where we're focusing on the diverse population of Miami. Miami is also called Capital of Latin America, and our next session will be called Identity and Belonging, Miami, Capital of Latin America. It's a city where the dominant language, the main language, is Spanish. It's often described as the least American of cities, at least the least North American of cities, and it has extensive ties to the Latin American world. And that's in many ways what makes it such a rich melting pot of different cultures. Our guests today are Patricia Elso. Patricia was recently graduated as a student from FIU, Florida International University. She was brought up in Cuba, and in fact started studying design in Cuba before moving to the States and continuing her studies in Miami. She therefore makes a wonderful person to figurehead that's very close in age to many of our Doctor of Design candidates, and with a very immediate and rich background in Cuban culture, and of course some of her family are still there. I'm also delighted to welcome Marilise Nepomeche, my distinguished colleague, a full professor. She's been the president of AXA. She's currently president of NAB. She is central to Cuban culture in Miami. She is the author of a guide to Miami, Building Paradise, an architectural guide to the Magic City, and many other publications to do with Miami, sea level rise, and Cuba. Jaime Canaves needs no introduction. He is quite an icon within the southern Florida architectural landscape. He presented a session a few weeks ago on Miami and film. And I'd like to thank him because one of our doctoral design students came to Miami, and he was an incredible host and showed her real Cuban hospitality. Jorge Tabella is another one from the younger generation. He's actually second generation Cuban. His father came from Cuba. And that, I think, is part of the story because we have first generation, second generation, and indeed, I guess, third generation Cubans in Miami. Jorge was my student initially, working. Well, I say my student. I had the pleasure of working with Jorge in his thesis project, where he's working at machine learning. He was the first person working on AI at FIU, and now he's in charge of the RDF lab, the robotics lab. And from that point of view, it's a great opportunity to introduce him to the DDES candidates. A couple of weeks ago, we had a session on borders, and I introduced it by commenting that somehow, when I reflected on it, somehow my whole life has been at the kind of under the shadow of the border with the communist world. I was brought up in Hong Kong, within 5 miles of the border with mainland China, next, very close to what is now the city of Shenzhen, this bustling metropolis that dwarfs Hong Kong. In those days, it was simply a series of villages and farms. It's completely transformed. But nonetheless, I grew up under that shadow. Later on, I was brought up in what was West Germany. My father was in the British forces there, and it was when the Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain. And there was always something as a young man, a young boy, being brought up in West Germany, very mysterious about the other side of the wall. And in fact, Rem Koolhaas wrote his final AA thesis on the wall and about the mysteriousness of what lies beyond that wall. And to my mind, it was always very mysterious, in part because all the movies at the time, James Bond and so on, always portrayed the spies as beautiful but rather dangerous Eastern European spies. I was completely fascinated as a young boy by the wall itself. Subsequent to that, I ended up teaching in what the former GDR, the former German Democratic Republic, in Indesa, where the Bauhaus is. I've never managed to get to Cuba. Cuba has always been something incredibly fascinating for me. I was due to go to a conference that was cancelled at the last moment, and I had been planning to go in March of last year before COVID hit. I think one thing is that you somehow get to know Cuba to some extent through Miami because of the very rich culture of Cuban culture there. But it remains this enchanting, mysterious place, not least because it's sort of stuck in some ways in some form of time warp. On our poster, you can see on the left-hand side the very vibrant kind of Miami culture that draws upon this Cuban vitality. On the right-hand side, Havana itself with these extraordinary cars from the 1950s that are still maintained and still go. So it's kept in some kind of time warp. So the way that we plan to start today is to begin with Patricia making the main presentation, and she has some images to show of life in Cuba and so on, and then I invite my colleagues to join in a conversation. I'm sure you'll find out as much as anything else from the conversation itself what it is to be Cuban. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Patricia and thank her for agreeing to make a presentation about her work. I should say that we shall be closing this session at 11 o'clock EST, which is in 1 hour, 50 minutes time. It'll be slightly shorter than usual, but I'm sure it'll be no less special. So Patricia, welcome.
Well, thank you. And I would like to say that I am very grateful to be invited to this lecture and to share with you all my experience. Growing up in Cuba, having my teenagers in Cuba, and just enjoying the island before I came to Miami. I put together a presentation, and every part of the presentation has in some form being very special personally to me and to my family. And so I think I got a little bit too much of pictures, so I'll try to make it fast so I don't go over any time and we can have more of a discussion afterwards.
Patricia, take your time, please. I mean, I'm sure it's
thank you. I wanted to start with this picture. This is the Cathedral of Old Havana. It's a Baroque style of architecture. It came about in the 1700s, and it's one of the most visited places when you go to Old Havana. This building in particular is special to me because when Eusebio Leal, which was the official historian of Old Havana, started the program of restoring the city, he started with this building. And at that time, my father, who was studying civil engineer, he collaborated with Eusebio. He needed students and everybody that could help, and the community would volunteer to help restore this cathedral back in, not exactly know when, 80s, I think, 1980s. And so I remember my father telling me stories about how the study came about, and some parts of the cathedral itself, they have to take stone by stone apart, number them, create a system in order to be able to put the building back together to its original design. And some of these pictures I took, this was a cloudy, rainy day, but I try to use all my pictures. And so this is some of the details of the cathedral inside and on the doors and the altar itself. And it's a very intricate work, it's very detail oriented. You can see the style mostly at its glory. Everything was original. Pretty much they could salvage everything almost. And so this is what started me listening to my father's stories about how this came about, my interest and curiosity more and more for the city itself. Afterwards, he continued working with Eusebio, and he would take me with him along with my sisters. And so since we were very little, we were always walk up and down Old Havana. This is the Capitolio, the National Capitolio of Havana, and it came about in the 1900s, and it was made by the then President Machado to be used as a governmental entity and building, as a public building. The way I remember this building has always been under construction. Always been trying to restore, and just like this. I think this picture, I took it in 2018, last time I went to the island. And I was very happy to know that the building itself, which has been a museum for all this time, they were able to restore it to its glory for 2015, which was the 500th anniversary of La Habana being founded. And this is how it looks now. This was the day of the event. This was me back then, taking pictures, always full of flowers. The parks are beautiful. And just, I remember from very little, with school work and school trips, always coming to the Capitolio. It was part of class to come to the museum to see all the interior spaces, the meeting rooms, and the complete different style of modern architecture that we see today, but it's very, very well kept. And so it's another site that is mostly visited when people think of Havana and when people go visit. This is the Grand National Theater, el Gran Teatro Nacional, which today hosts the National Ballet of Havana. And it used to be the Castillo de Castilla way before, which was just an event palace for a very high-end club class. And it became the National Theater. Is beautiful. You can see that all the ground floor is full of colonnades, which is a very colonial style for architecture to help with the environment. Cuba is very hot, and this will help with the sun and the rain. And I always, every time I could, I will come and enjoy this building and enjoy all the ballet events that I could come to it. This is the interior of the building. This is the main room, the stage, and you can see how detailed. All these are my pictures. They're a little old, but you can see all the work detail on the walls. It was also restored, and there is a university in all Havana that is completely dedicated to restoration of Patrimonio Nacional, which is these type of buildings. So they did an amazing job restoring it and bringing it to its original glory, and is in use almost every day with all type of ballet, theater, even cinema. Which brings me to this picture that is Plaza Vieja, also known as Plaza De Las Palomas. And all Havana itself is full of plazas. Just like Havana, Vedado is full of parks every so often. It's very inviting, very pedestrian-like, again, with all the colonnade style, so it can protect you from the sun, from the rain. And always this, every so often you get these open spaces, which is to gather people, to create events, and always full of people. This corner here, which is very, very, very typically dense and transit, is where we have La Casa de la Cerveza, the beer house. And then on this side, we also have El Escorial, which is the coffee house. So you have one or the other, and it's always full. And so the streets in between are small, they're very pedestrian-like. The buildings are usually 2 stories, maybe 3 stories high, so they provide shade constantly to the street. And you have this style of mampara, which are the doors that almost go to the ceiling, and then the vitrales. the stained glass work that is very, very, very repetitive all throughout old Havana. You see this type of ornamentation on the buildings, that it was not only to bring light into the space, but also to bring a kind of ambience light, because it would bring the color of the glass, and it was just not the sun burning, but it would try to ease that and give some color to the space. Always full of balconies, and this used to be residential on the second floor always, and then commercial on the ground floor. Nowadays they have offices, and they used to open all these doors and let the breeze come in. And I believe that they have restored these buildings and incorporated some AC, but before it used to be always open. And this, I wanted to show this picture because I can relate this stain of glass vitral with this one here, that is very dear to us, me and my family, because this is a hotel that is right in front of the Port of Havana, and it was restored, and some of the hotel was in very bad condition, some of the ceilings, and so they found this solution for it, to create light wells and skylights and close them with vitrales. This specific vitral is made by a famous vitralera, is a Cuban artisan, Ana Maria, and she collaborated with my father to create this vitral. And I remember that I was very little, maybe 10, 11 years old, and I would help make all these lines of lead, which was used because of its flexibility qualities, in order to combine the glasses. So every color is a different crystal, and they all get together by this line of lead, and they all put together, combined, create the whole mural, vitral. And it's completely open to the outside. So at this point, which this is a third floor, you can see the light coming in, and it's a restaurant underneath, and there are a couple of these, and it's just create a beautiful atmosphere inside. Which takes me to El Malecón de La Habana. So no matter which street you are in Old Havana, in Vedado, in Centro Havana, if you go north, you will always end up at El Malecón. I remember that every time I could, every week I would go to El Malecón. The Malecón can be a little bit unforbidden since it doesn't provide shade alone. It's line access, but usually after 3, 4 o'clock, students are out of school, and parents and people are out of work at 5, and so they all come to El Malecón. It's a place to be, to hang out, to enjoy the view, to enjoy the city and the ocean right next to you. And it's also a cultural hub. A lot of musicians just go to El Malecón to play music, to entertain people. And just like here in Miami, we have Art Basel. In Havana, we have La Bienal, which is the annual art festival. And they use El Malecón as one of the main exhibit places to showcase the artwork that is produced by Cuban artists. And so the entire Malecón becomes this gallery exhibit, and people put on their best clothes, and they go and they open it and they enjoy the artwork. And it's just amazing, fantastic, just to walk down with the ocean breeze and the skyline on one side, and with your friends and family, and spend hours there enjoying it. Which connects Old Havana to Vedado, Centro Havana, and these are just some of the examples of the different styles of architecture that we can see. We have modern architecture with Havana Libre, which used to be the Hilton Hotel. And it's called now Havana Libre, with a mural of Amalia Peláez, which is a very famous artist. And we have some Mediterranean architecture with the National Hotel, El Hotel Nacional, which is very similar to the Breakers Hotel here in South Florida. I personally find all alone similarities between Miami and styles and Cuba all the time. And this is the famous Yara, which is on 23rd Calle 23 and El Avenue, and it's a cinema plaza. And then the Riviera Hotel, the Coiba Hotel, which are a little bit more modern architecture along the Malecón. These hotels are along the Malecón, National Hotel too. And we also find one of those pearls that are completely different style, Moroccan style architecture in Cuba. Like every so often you will find something that is completely different from the adjacent buildings, and it's very interesting to me how that happened, who decided to build that, and how it got there. So this is an old picture of Paseo del Prado, and Paseo del Prado is very historic promenade that goes all the way from El Capitolio to El Malecón. And that Moroccan style building from the slide before is right here, is this one here. And you can see from early on how some of the old cars, that always people walking, and always the colonnade protecting us from the sun with very high ceilings, so the heat will go up and we'll get the breeze of the ocean. Always thinking about a pedestrian kind of urban fabric that would alleviate the harsh environment on us. And this is El Prado today. It has become another cultural hub for artisans to display their work. It's like this every day of the week. It's not only during the weekends, but Monday through Sunday, you will see this little handmade kiosk stands where they showcase their art, their paintings, their crochet, everything they do by hand. This is also their living, so they try to sell what they made. And this is back in 2016, I think it was, that it was a fashion show and a collaboration between fashion designers from the island and fashion designers around the world. Chanel was here between others, and they just made the entire, I think, 2-3 blocks of Paseo del Prado into a marvelous catwalk. You can see all the tile and the floor and full of trees, canopy trees, and then the buildings in the background, and the old cars, Chevys, all lined up. This was a very Cuban usual imaging. And while living and growing up in this environment and walking all around, I was also going to school. And this was my school, Instituto Superior de Diseño. This was the design university, the only one in Cuba. If you were from a specific province, you would apply, then get accepted, and then come live in Havana to come to the school for 4 years. It's a typical colonial building, square with interior courtyards, balconies, the windows all opened, and a symmetrical park plaza right next to it in the corner. It used to be a newspaper building. And so it had these very open spaces inside that were perfect for classrooms. And it got closed for a couple of decades. And then it was renovated specifically to become the University of Design. And this is how it was my years there. I spent 2 years in this university before I came to Miami. And all of these are my pictures. Sorry about the little bit of low quality, that was 10 years ago. That's how the interior courtyard was. And it was used mainly for events of all kinds. All the time it was completely active. And this year specifically was the 25th anniversary of the university. So we all worked on creating this event, a very special one. And for a whole month, we had tournaments and we had fashion shows from the fashion students in the university. We had sports, badminton, chess tournaments, dominoes tournaments. Dominoes never was missed. It was always there. And so the student culture was very engaging and active all the time, trying to create anything that would resemble design. And the hallways of the university, just like here, we did pin-up and we'll showcase our work, and the university would engage on the community. So the community will come in and will see what we were doing, and that way more people will be interested about what design was in Cuba, in Havana, and how it could be portrayed and worked on later on. This is just some of the work I did. We had drawing class, and all of these were done by hand. And I don't know if this was my station, and I used to use this, which was an egg tray for the refrigerator, and just a bottle of water cut for water. And the paintings we would share with everyone because we usually didn't have enough. But and then these were my friends painting, and we had like 1 hour, and we had to do something in an hour in a time of class, and then continue on the next class and so on. But we always had to do the work in the university itself, unless it was like a final that we had to work at home. But professors always encouraged us to work in so they could see our work and help us. And I remember that resources were not there, so we used to find ways to how to mitigate with these problems and find solutions to the things that we wanted to do, because the fact that we didn't have some things didn't mean that we wouldn't do it anyways. So a couple of blocks from my house, there was a framing company, and I remember going there almost every week. And I became friends with them, and I would tell them that I was a design student and I needed some materials, and then they would give me their scraps, and then I would go to school and share whatever I got that week with everybody else, and we could then go ahead and do some work. And that was normal, the way to go. This is just very early work. And we would see how to integrate form with typography. And this specifically was a project that for a film festival, we needed to come up with some posters that only using certain typography, letters, fonts, we needed to convey a concept of movie or picture rolls or things like that. And this was my design, using the Bauhaus font, only the D, T's, and O, and creating a poster that later on was served to commercialize and advertise film festival in Havana. And then we were asked to use the same design to create some sort of container that you could grab and go photography rolls, because in this time we would use photography rolls and we would take pictures with cameras and develop them. And so this was my solution with that. Again, everything was hand drawn, even these were all hand drawn. And again, the framing company would give me the cardboards, and that was the way of doing this. This was another project that it was for children, and how to help develop children's mind in terms of design. And so it was meant to be some sort of puzzle that you will have a sphere and then you will have a linear element, and how you connect them in order to create different shapes and to create something functional out of them. So it will help the children to connect different forms at the same time, and to at some point trying to create something that could be functional, like a pencil holder or something like that. And that was this one. We will have our fabrication labs and work with ceramics, pottery, metal work, woodwork, and we will learn everything about the materials, their qualities, and how to work with them in order to create whatever we needed to create in the moment, like whatever product that will be in, what will be the best material for it. And this was just part of all the machinery we had available to us in the university itself. And then, like usual, after a final or one of those deadlines that we'll have at school, we would get out and go to Old Havana. The thing to do was always get out of school and go somewhere that you can socialize, be culturally engaged. And this was a group of acrobats gymnastics that will be in Old Havana from Friday to Sundays. And this was my cousin, and she loved it. She would be there every weekend, and they would do some circus work around Havana, and then every weekend they would be here, and they would go up and down the streets with their music. They had musical instruments, and they would play with children, and they would just be so much fun and activate the community. Whoever was walking down the street at this moment, they would stop, they would engage with them, and they loved that. Brings me then to Miami. So I come to Miami on my second year of university, and for me it was a little bit of a shock. I come here and I felt a little bit isolated. I didn't understand very well the city, because everything I wanted to go, I'll have to hop on a vehicle to go there. I couldn't just walk. And in Havana, I would walk everywhere. So I remember that I came in October, and in December, I entered Miami-Dade College in Wolfson campus, which is in the hub of downtown. And I got a retail job in Bayside, which is right in front of it. And so from Monday through Fridays, I would go to the train station, and from the train station to the Metro Rail, from the Metro Rail to the school, full of maquetas and models and boxes with materials. And then I'll be half day at the college and half day at Bayside working. And in between, I would just walk up and down downtown. I would end up in Little Haiti. I would end up in Brickell. I would end up in, later on, Wynwood. And that's how I started becoming familiar with Miami and started loving it. Then later on, I went to Fiu School of Architecture, and I had the opportunity to study at MBUS, Miami Beach Urban Studios, where I was right there in the hub of Lincoln Road. And that was amazing for me. I would spend my days in the studio working. In the afternoons, I would come down, walk Lincoln Road, go to the beach, Ocean Drive, and again start exploring the city. I would love to get in between the streets and find out, well, what's this? And what style is this? And how different is this? And all in between those, I will always find this type of condominiums, little hubs community of apartments that they always had some sort of interior courtyard. And that was very familiar to me from Cuba. And so more and more, I want to say 12 years ago, Miami has exponentially developed, and this amazing urban fabric that is no longer Calle Ocho and is no longer ball and chain. Like, there's so much to do to engage culture with. Um, I loved going to Windward Walls, where it's so dense, full of people walking on the streets, going in and out of little alleys, and you find something anywhere. And then Design District came up, and that was another amazing place, amazing cultural hub. Definitely always full of events. There's a Palm Courtyard. They're always doing something, always activating. And that's what I love the most in Miami, the similarity from Cuba, that people are always wanting to be somewhere, socializing, engaging into culture, engaging into the city urban fabric, and finding things to do outside. And so that takes me to this picture where I try once a year to go back to Cuba, where my older sister is still at. And this was one of the only times that we're being able to be all together. This is my mom. These are my two sisters. I'm here, my two nephews, and my dad is taking the picture. And we don't get to be all together like that often. So this was a very special day to me. And this was in Plaza Vieja, right where La Casa de las Cervezas is. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks. That was amazing. I don't want to sort of step in because I think what I really love to see is some sort of discussion carrying on among the Cubans here and the students who are with us as well, candidates. So let me just invite a series of kind of questions. Maybe I can just kick off with one thing. I guess the thing that surprised me, I mean, it was beautiful. Thank you so much, Patricia. It really was a wonderfully kind of personal journey, and a lot of things came out in your description that were very warm, and it really was very personal. But one thing that came out was I was surprised to see you doing a painting of a Coca-Cola can. Is things like that readily available in Havana?
Well, yes, because in Havana, there are places where you can find very worldwide items, global items, for the sake of the tourism. Now, the tourism in Cuba is very, very, very crucial and important for the economic status of the island. So when you go to hotels, when you go to certain places of the island, even restaurants here in old Havana that cater for mainly a tourist audience, you will find Coca-Cola cans, you will find Sprite, and you will find Budweiser beer, and you will find all kinds of things that that are very global consumed.
Great. Let me just open this up to some discussion. I especially would be interested in hearing how other members of the panel would kind of comment on or build upon your experiences. So yeah, that's great. Could you leave a photograph of Havana rather than Miami? Yeah, maybe that one. Yeah, great.
That one? Okay.
Yeah. So let me invite some comments from the audience. Jaime, can I just ask you one thing? How long ago since you left Havana, and do you go back often there? Because I know you do, because you take students there.
Oh, you're in mute, Jaime.
You're muted. Okay.
You're still muted there.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe Yoga, you could step in and also tell me about, because Yoga, your father, I understand, is from Cuba, and your mother not from Cuba, so you're a very different generation. You're second generation, as it were, within Miami. How does Patricia's story kind of resonate with the way you see Cuba through your father's background?
To be honest, it's quite refreshing, and it's a different perspective. I grew up in you know, raised on the Cuban side of my family, in a small little kind of Cuban community in Carroll City, or which is now known as Miami Gardens, and it was a completely different perspective. It was more of a darker view of what it was, because it was politically charged with what was happening at the time. You know, my grandfather was the one who took the family away from Cuba. Post the Bay of the Pigs, and the rise of Fidel Castro. He left in the early '70s because he was caught sabotaging against the Fidel's government, and he left in the freedom flights in '71. So when he got over here, it was as a refugee, and he kind of saw the country that he loved fall apart. So he would explain to me when he was younger, how beautiful the country is, how vibrant, pretty much everything Patricia was outlining. But that was for the first, 15, 16 years of his life, and then after that, it was, it got very dark quickly. And that was a lot of the things that I would hear about Cuba, and it's also interesting to see that, Patricia visits frequently back to Cuba, because in my family and other Cuban families that have, this similar background, it was kind of brought up to be forbidden for me to go back, because any attempt for me to go back was me spending money and empowering the Cuban government, and not really seeing the real Cuba for what it is, because I would be visiting as a tourist with, tourist money, and the real Cuba is somewhat different. You have to go search for that when you're there, and that's what Patricia gets. She has her family there, she has her roots there, she's able to see and experience what Cuba really is, versus the as we're labeling it, the Coca-Cola side. So I kind of had this understanding of it, but it is refreshing to see that, it's still that, it is an island of people with love, passion, and things like that, which is something that I didn't hear of, but was able to experience, because, Cubans bring that flair wherever they go, so I was able to experience that, for a very long, and Cubans love Cuba no matter what happens. That is the land that they love. I remember growing up, recently, I was thinking about it driving over today to campus, but for a very long time, I used to think that for Christmas and New Year's, the Cuban national anthem was just a song that was played for Christmas and New Year's, because I would sit down in the living room with my grandfather and, all the families, and they would play the song over and over and over again, drinking rum and celebrating. So for a while, I just thought that was a part of the culture of Christmas and New Year's, but it wasn't until I got older that I realized that it was the Cuban national anthem. So it's a refreshing perspective, seeing it from somebody's eyes, somebody, around my age that comes from over there, and doesn't necessarily have the front end experience of the rise of Fidel Castro. Obviously, everybody feels what happened, but it wasn't that front end, experience in the war type situation, the revolutions, all that. So I don't know, Jaime. It'd be interesting to see your perspective on it, because you get the injection of the young and the old.
My apologies that I was on mute when you asked me the question before. It was in 1961 that I came to the United States, and it was not in reality by choice, which is a question that I would love to ask Patricia. But it was like Jorge was explaining, a change to the dark, from growing in a place that you enjoy tremendously, that even though we were under a dictator, you felt that you had, quite a bit of freedom, and especially as a child, teenager, you did not feel that, and then suddenly things change in a hurry, not in regards to the architecture, to the spaces, but in regards to your freedoms, and to the point that you couldn't express anything at all because you would be afraid. I was in my school stopped by a janitor, and they searched me simply because somebody placed a sign down with the revolution or down with Fidel. And I was stopped and searched. And I'm glad that I didn't have anything to do with that, because something as simple as that, they could take you to a prison. But it was also the change in the economy, the change in everything. So it's a different perspective altogether. And it's still a beautiful place. But at the same time, when you look at the picture of the school that Patricia went to, that school looks beautiful, but if you realize the building next doors, they were falling apart. When you go to old Havana, it has been restored, and Leal is considered, one of the heroes of architecture, and it's one that is respected internationally because basically with this effort, they saved the old Havana part. But you step out of that, and even in old Havana, there are still people living under conditions that you cannot believe, where buildings are falling down. Now, through the years of the revolution, the economy has changed back and forth. And the spirit of the Cuban people is one of no matter what the situation is, let's try to have a good time and enjoy life. But I would like to ask Patricia, because she seems to have enjoyed very much her youth, the growing up in Havana. Why that change of leaving the family, especially, and coming to Miami?
Jaime, to answer your question, just like you said, the Cuban people has such a vibrant way of being. Is such a always look for the better side, positive kind of culture. And yes, we used to live in Vedado, and with the years, little by little, families went away. They came to Miami, and it got to a point that we were the only remaining ones. My mom is a family of 3 sisters. My dad has a brother. They all had gone with their sons and daughters and family to Miami here. And even though I had a very, very good upbringing, I believe that my parents did an amazing job protecting me from any negative aspect of living in Cuba. We were a very happy family. We were always together. We would do everything together. And we had some harish, like every single Cuban family. And that's the reason why we decided as a family to try and go look for a better future. The reason why my father was the first one to leave the island, and then little by little he brought us here, and until a series of events happened that my sister fortunately is still there, but she has created a family of her own, and with our help, she's also, living the best that she can do over there. She's a very good, successful doctor, and she's happy that she was able to pursue that career. And so I go back every time I can. Last time I went was 2018, and now with COVID and everything, I have not been able to go back, but I miss her dearly, and I just try to go and see her and be with her every year if possible.
Jaime,
And
I'm wondering.
it's mainly the difference of in my case that I felt a very strong change in all the aspects of the economy, and the younger generation that they grew up under that system, and it doesn't matter how good or how bad it is the system that you grew up with, and you try to make the best out of that, that system. And you see that difference in the Miami area. The people that came very early to the people that have come, like Patricia, the people that have been born in here, like Jorge, and you see the difference in perspective to what Havana is or was.
Yeah, it's I'm interested, Patricia. Did you feel when you transitioned over here? Because Jaime actually lived through the freedom, and the deprivation of freedom with the fall of Batista and the rise of Fidel. But you were born into that Fidel government. Did you feel any type of release of oppression when you migrated to Miami, or did it feel the same? Was there any feeling different as freedom wise is concerned?
To answer your question, Jorge, there is so many things that are limitants in the island that one cannot do, enjoy, or aspire to, that you definitely see the difference when you come to Miami. And it's just, I think that everything comes down to the economical aspect of it. Having to, hard to meet ends meet as a family with children. And but I personally, when I was growing up in Cuba, it was completely different than before. I didn't see that type of crime towards people. I didn't see that type of abuse. I was not engaged political either. I was just a regular student, a normal person that would go about my studies, about my life, And but when you're in the island, back when I was in the island with no internet, with no access to so many things, and I arrived to Miami, it was definitely an eye-opener. It was definitely something that you cannot imagine. You didn't know it existed because you didn't know about it. So we have a say that until you get out, you will understand what it is that you've been into. And that's exactly what happened. When I arrived to Miami, then I understood what it was being there and then being out.
That's interesting. That's refreshing because I don't get too much of the perspective of people that most of the people that I deal with are second generation Cuban people, and the first generation people are kind of from the perspective of my grandfather, and I see everything through the lens of my grandfather because when my dad moved over here, he was very young, so he had a very skewed image of what Cuba was, because for him, being 8-10 years old when he came over here, it's just as much of a paradise to a kid as it is to anywhere else. So I've only heard of it through my grandpa's. But it's interesting to see that kind of modern day, you don't feel it until you leave it kind of situation, because it's all and it makes sense to a point. Out of curiosity, I mean, you've established a life here and stuff like that. Would you ever live in Cuba in any capacity of having a home over there or things like that? Because it sounds like you'd like to go back and forth. Or how do you think things are changing, or are they changing now with? And again, it circles back to Cuba, because sorry, it circles back to politics because it's heavily into the Cuban culture, but like kind of, with the Cuban government, how it is now, where do you see things going on? Because you have more, your ear on the ground, having your sister live there and being actively part of the country. So.
Right. Well, definitely, things are happening. Things are changing. Before it was very usual, like Jaime said, that people would express their feelings about the revolution because it was so fresh, and that was not something that they would accept, or that was not something that they would like after living in Cuba all their life, and all of a sudden there is this completely new rules that you don't know about, you don't accept, and you don't understand. So back then, it was definitely more active, this type of what they call insurrection. But me growing up, not so much. I was born, in the 90s, and the revolution had been there for 40 years already, and everybody was adapting, and they were just trying to live their lives, because not everybody could flee the island, and they still have to live their life. So nowadays, though, more and more people have internet in the island and have access to broader information and what's happening in the world and how are things in other places. And so I think that they feel as now they have a little bit more control of what they can decide on and how they want to live. And that's why we see some of the changes that we're seeing now. I don't think that changes the government. I don't think that makes a big change, but it's definitely happening. Something is starting, and it's important to acknowledge that.
Patricia, maybe you could just change onto another image, because these are great images. But maybe you could just go to.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think what it comes across is maybe one of the people alive in the streets, or that one. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, this actually reminds me of the Ramblas in Barcelona. It's really, except we don't have the kind of kiosks and the kind of the trappings of capitalism, but it really, in terms of it's very Hispanic in the way people are getting together and talking and so on. It's really, that's a beautiful picture, I must say. There's one comment I was going to make, because when I was teaching in Dessau, we had a student from Japan, and I mean, she had wanted to leave Japan to go and study somewhere else, and didn't see herself as very Japanese. But once she got to Germany, she felt much more Japanese, and I guess I find the same. I mean, I was never very nationalistic at all, never. I'm still not, but and I would never watch the England football match. I just thought it was too nationalistic. But once I came to the States, there are certain things I kind of clung on to. I wanted to keep my British accent. The worst thing is my sister keeps telling me that that I'm losing it. I'm going to be American, but I've got a little mini car, a little sort of convertible, and in some ways I kind of cherish it in some ways. So yeah. Do you feel in some ways more Cuban? I mean, this is more a kind of question, I guess. But in some cases, Jaime has been out for some time, but that's certainly a phenomenon. And certainly we have among our candidates, many have moved. It's the interesting thing, actually. Almost every single member of our team has actually moved from one country to another. Have you experienced the kind of missing the place once you've left the place, and feeling more Cuban once you left Cuba? That was a question maybe for Jaime.
Oh, remember in the last in my lecture, I told you guys I am a Miamian because I still feel extremely Cuban, but the Cuba that I grew up with does not really exist anymore socially and culturally. You have the places there, and but you don't have the rest. My son, that was born in the United States, had a T-shirt that I loved. It said "Made in America" or "in Miami" with Cuban parts, and I thought it was a good way to relate to it. And you feel the changes, not when you go to Cuba that it's an extreme of things, because in Cuba you can go to places that cater, tourism, and that made a big change in Cuba, because for a while Fidel did not allow people to go out of Cuba or people to come in as tourists. So it was tremendous amount of control. When they were forced to open tourism for economical reason, they realized that they couldn't control the information as they did before, as Patricia was explaining, because they control the news, they control everything coming in. There was only 2 TV channels, and both were controlled by the government. There were a few radio stations controlled by the government, and all the newspapers. So you couldn't get any information from the outside. With tourism, that began to change, and they couldn't have as much of a control. But having grown up in Miami, which is a very unique place, and again, what I love about Miami is that you have the American system with the Latin flavor. Because even in places like Caracas, Venezuela, before Chavez, my brother lives in Caracas, and the economy was great, and it's a beautiful city. To get a telephone installed, it takes 8 months to a year and a half, and that's after you bribe a few people. If not, it will probably take 2 years. And you still have a lot of places that the social aspects are, totally different. And something as simple as if they accuse you of something and they take you to a prison, there's no such thing as a bond. You may spend 1 year in prison waiting for a trial, and then you may be innocent and they allow you to go, but you spend a year in prison. So there are a lot of social aspects and protection in the United States. With all the problem, it's not a perfect system. But if I'm going to be poor or middle class, I would rather be in the United States. I feel a lot more protected than in most countries, especially that in Latin America. I have not experienced living in Europe. So if you're wealthy, you can live any place in the world and have a good life. But if you're middle class, I like the United States, and especially Miami. So even though my roots are Cuban, even though I feel very strongly, and I still get emotional, as Patricia felt toward the end of the presentation. And I'm sure that when Jorge Tuela talks about the national anthem in his family during Christmas, I think that he forgot to mention people crying and saying next year will be in Cuba, in a free Cuba. So you had all those feelings, but in reality, I feel that I'm an American, and I feel that I'm a Miamian with still a deep love for my Cuban roots.
Yeah, maybe one comment to ask is that, I mean, it's great that we've got these different generations, as it were, and I'm intrigued by, you know, the difference between those who maybe came across to Miami, you know, planning to go back, compared to those who are now see their roots in Miami and don't really have that aspiration. And it's just maybe a question for Jorge. Does your family, how do you see yourself different to your father or grandfather in terms of your relationship to Cuba? That is, yeah.
Uh, okay. Before I answer that question, I want to piggyback off of the question that Jaime answered. You asked of, you know, do you feel more Cuban leaving Cuba? Me being born in America, obviously, I feel very American. You know, I love this country, and I feel super American when I'm in Miami because I see, you know, Miami as this. This is a America that I've come to know and was raised. I was born and raised in Miami, lived here my whole life. It's not until I leave Miami, which is like this little special hub, and I go, you know, Orlando, you know, Central Florida, or a little bit north of Florida, and I'm just like, I feel super Cuban, or you know, half Nicaraguense. My mom is from Nicaragua. You know, I feel very Hispanic, and I'm able to, and it's kind of like you were mentioning with your Japanese student. You know, it kind of brings that out and it fleshes it into the light. So I do feel very Cuban, and my heritage and culture, and how I was raised and things, and I understand how I guess the main part of America works, and we live in a very special place in Miami, and how it functions. You know, primarily being Cuban, but now, you know, there's a lot more injection of different countries that are coming in here, like Venezuela. There's a lot of Colombians. You know, so the paradigm is changing, but the culture remains the same. And at the end of the day, it is still a very special place to be. And I haven't experienced that, not even going to New York, you know, which has also Cubans and Puerto Ricans and things like that. So Miami has a completely different vibe. It might be because it's hot and humid here always, you know, and it's similar to some of these other countries, but it has a different vibe than, you know, New York, Texas, California, and things that I've experienced. Now, the way that I view, to answer your current question, the way that I view the country and things like that. So my grandpa left. He never wanted to go back. He always felt like he wanted to go back, but he knew in actuality it was never going to be the same. And his life was here, and he almost felt robbed of his, like he got robbed of his life experiences because he was forced to come over here. It was either that, go to jail, or you know, be killed by the government. So that instantly rubbed off onto my father. And my father never wanted to visit Cuba. He's never talked to me about visiting Cuba. He's shared the same very passionate feelings that my grandfather had, and you know, it even rubbed off into his political views of you know, where we are right now with the American voting, the elections that just passed, and things like that, which you know, there's a reason why Cubans are so pro-Trump, and it has to do with what happened over there in Cuba. But I am the first wave of the first generation of my family that actually wants to go visit and explore Cuba, you know, and not hear it from secondhand stories, but actually see it and feel for myself what is Cuba, you know, and make my own interpretation of it. And maybe perhaps enough time has passed by that I mean, it's not what it was when Jaime was there, but there's enough time that I can experience, you know, the culture, a direct injection of the culture, not the secondhand Americanized version of what it is, you know. And again, a lot of people that I've grown up with that are Cuban are second generation Cubans, you know, so they have the same perspective I have. So that's kind of the ideology that I grew up with. So I'd like to get it firsthand.
That's, I
You
mean,
know, to that, George, I would I would definitely like to recommend that whenever you decide that you're ready and you would like to go and visit the island, I would definitely advise you to go stay at Airbnb. There are many now. There are there have always been houses that are very well kept, and what the owners do is they rent the rooms and they provide you with breakfast service, and they're most attentive and warm people. Definitely in a centric place like Vedado. From Vedado, you can go and visit Old Havana, Miramar, which is more embassies and kind of that kind of style, big houses. To Vedado, to Centro Havana, everything is very, very centric. And if you really want to go and experience on your own, if you could go with a group of friends and not take any of the tourist tours, because they will always show you what they want to show you, but just go walk the city. It's easy and you will definitely enjoy a lot more.
Thanks for the tip, and I definitely take that into consideration when I travel.
One thing I'm struck actually is you way you describe it as the island, Patricia. I mean, I mean, I was brought up thinking about Cuba. I mean, it actually had a very dominant role in my background. My father was in charge of sport when he was in Germany, and Cuba had some incredible sports people. I was a track and field athlete, and Alberto Cantorina was really kind of famous. I also was struck by Teofilo Stevenson, who was this boxer who remained an amateur, and he kept on winning the gold medal at the Olympics, and he would knock people out, which is, it was only a 3-round tournament. He was absolutely amazing. So I had this sense of a kind of much more of a kind of powerhouse of a nation in some ways. And I don't know, my friends in Central Europe, in continental Europe, always joke about England being the island, as it were. So, and in fact, actually, just to say, it is actually England is about is 25 miles away from continental Europe, from Calais, which is roughly the same distance that Cuba is from Miami. You can swim it. You can swim it. It's probably actually you wouldn't want to swim the channel too much. It's a bit cold, but you can swim from Miami. I mean, it's really incredibly close. Let me invite some questions from the audience. Maybe Marina, do you have a question?
Yes, hello. Good morning from Argentina. I mean, near Buenos Aires in La Plata.
Morning.
And good morning. And thank you for your presentation. It was a great presentation and super interesting. And I'm studying about certain things that influentiate architects in the way we design. And for example, I was thinking about Aldo Rossi, scientific biography, for example, and this idea that your memoirs or your memories or the place where you born and where you grow up in a way influentiate the way you design. So my question is like, I'm super interested in the Cuban geography in a way, and how this idea of archipelago, for example, influentiate architectural imaginary. And in a way, it's something that is in different places, but in Cuba it's also there, and in a particular way. And so my question is like, in a way, are these logics, like the idea of the island or the idea of the archipelago, influentiate in the way that Cubans were to Miami, in the way you design the city, or think about the city of Miami, for example? Are these like a kind of migration of idea from Cuba to Miami? So my question is like, in a way, if I mean, is this idea of the island present still in Miami? How are the relations between Cubans and the different cultures that coexist in Miami? It's like a kind of island. It's like a kind of field condition, more expansive, more yes, like spread it into the territory. Or how do you live this idea, this condition?
Well, I think that, at least for me personally, I definitely relate, and I definitely try to use everything that I know to a means of my style and designs. And one thing that surprised me when I got here to Miami is that almost every house I went that from a Cuban family, it was kind of a trend to have this type of tier fountains in the either in their backyard, in their patio, or in the front of their house. And this idea to be connected to water at all times, to have it closed, I think is a lot within us. If you see, Cuba is surrounded by water entirely, but the cities either are at a water's edge, and on one side you have the water and on the other side you have the land. And that's how Miami kind of is too. To one edge you have on the west coast the land, and to the east coast you have the water, and then you have Miami Beach, which is like a completely island on its own, connected but separated at the same time. And so Miami and Cuba, and mainly Havana for me, are definitely related geographically and archipelagically as well. And me personally, I love to be close to water at all times. Like I love to, if I'm not driving by it, which is not hard to do here in Miami, definitely try to go and spend time by the beach and so on. I think that the style of construction in a way in Miami is very different than Cuba, because the scale is it's a completely different scale. It's not like you can just walk and walk and walk and go the places that you want to go. You need to depend on a transit on vehicle in order to go from one hub to another. But in a way, I try to incorporate always a feel of social engagement every time I design and so on. At work, I do a lot of master planning and destination planning, and I always try for some reason to keep it into a very small human scale, to make sure that whoever will visit the space will feel good, will feel fresh, will feel protected, and will feel in constant contact with the environment and with nature and everything that surrounds it. And I think that for us to be close to water, to be in contact with water at all times is something spectacular. And I think that Jaime can attest to that. Building his home right next to a lake, and is one of those things that I think that they're definitely in us to connect to that while we develop some type of style and design.
Can I ask a question regarding to this comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, oh, you can hear me, cool. I'm sorry, because I had problems with the microphone. Thanks, Patricia, for your presentation. That was amazing. So you're talking about the environment and designing for the environment. How do you think that the environment and nature and this relationship influences the community interaction? Because you mentioned that there's a lot of people are always out, and then they're always interacting, and there's always activities, and it's a very rich community life. So what is the relationship between the environment and nature and the richness of the community interaction?
Well, I can tell you that growing up in Havana was a very outdoor life. Most of the houses don't have AC, so we have usually high ceilings, so to refresh the house and allow for the heat to go up. Open windows, mostly creating kind of like wind tunnels. So you will open all the windows of the house and hopefully, or apartments. And even nowadays, they have been building some apartment buildings that they've called microbrigadas, and they try to incorporate windows at both ends so they can create a wind tunnel and facilitate for cooling without the need of AC. But living in Cuba is a very outdoor life. People don't like to be indoors or inside their houses. They like to be constantly out, socialing with neighbors. Children are always playing on the streets, on their sidewalks, and there is a sense of protection. When I was growing up, I would play a lot on like underneath my apartment building on the streets with my friends, and there were always parents looking out for us, and so that's where the sense of nature, trees, shading will come in play, because the streets are not big. There are a couple of, every so often you have wide avenues, but mainly there are small streets, only 2 lanes, and that would facilitate and provide for the wind from the ocean to come by and again create this kind of breeze that goes along from one end of the malecon to the other end of the malecon. And sometimes it gets really, really, really hot, really, really humid, and then, we will be by the shade. But every time that there's a sort of restoration or a design or some sort of building, they always incorporate trees and plants and make sure that there is canopy shade for pedestrian activity, because at all times the city is constantly active and walking and dense of people out, and that's just the way it is.
So with your experience in Miami, what do you think that how much of that Cuban influence in that regards do you think there is in Miami? Okay, do you think that there is, because Jorge was saying that he feels American when he's in Miami and he feels Cuban when he's outside Miami. So how much of that influence in the city and in the cultural life of the city do you think that there's a Cuban influence? How strong is the Cuban influence in bringing this to making Miami, Miami?
Well, when there have been different waves of Cuban through the years coming into Miami, but some of that first wave in the 50s and in the 60s, that people that came to Miami, they were mostly professionals, doctors, architects, professors, and all these people kind of like engaged in the city, and there was a high density population of Cuban professionals in Coral Gables and South Miami, and it became a very strong sense of culture, because they wanted to have what they had in Cuba here. And so they wanted to keep having their lifestyle. I think that Miami, in sense of scale and urban fabric, is still kind of detached, and that's what I meant why, for example, you can go from Wynwood to Design District, but it's hard to go from Wynwood to Miami Beach Lincoln Road, or to go to Coconut Grove, or to go now Doral, that is getting more and more developed and dense. And all of these are kind of like different culture hubs that something is standing out and that you want to be a part of. And I think that what George kind of talked about is that I'm sure that back in the 60s, 70s, there were a lot of Americans here. And after 60 decades now, is definitely intensify Hispanic culture that is a melting pot of all Latin America and even Europe, and more are coming. And so Miami is a very special place. It's definitely a mix of culture in all regards. And just like he said, when you go a little bit up north, it is different and you notice it because everybody wants to be in Miami because it's the closest to, I think, what they know from home. And I think that's also what they're looking for. Definitely better life, definitely a better future for them and their family, and definitely something that is familiar to where they come from.
I think that you made a very good point, Patricia, especially when you describe the first wave of Cuban being mostly professional, but there was another factor that was important. When they came, it was simply for 1 or 2 years, even 6 months, because the mentality was there was no way that the Americans are going to allow a social communistic system that close to the United States. So sooner or later, they're going to invade or take care of Castro. And I think that the big difference for that first wave of Cubans was it took anywhere from 5 to 10 years that they realized that it was not going to be quick. They still thought that it was temporary and that we were all going back, and next Christmas, las próximas Navidades in Havana, that mentality still exists. But at the same time, the Cuban mentality of, okay, but on the meantime, I have to adapt and I have to do my best in here. And that was an important part of beginning to change your the mentality of I'm here on a temporary basis, I'm going back, to I have no idea when I'm coming back, but in the meantime, I'm going to make the best out of it. And there was the first, I think, Cuban American newscasters in American news, Manolo Reyes. He said in public, when the Cubans began to become American citizens, because we were here as refugees and then residents, but when we began to become American citizens, Manolo Reyes said on TV that he will consider a traitor to the Cuban cause any Cuban that becomes an American citizen. 5 years later, Manolo Reyes became an American citizen, and he apologized to everyone, but I couldn't become a professional architect unless I was an American citizen, as simple as that. So, but that change of mentality of, well, we may go back, but we have no idea when. Let's make the best out of Miami, began the transition. And as you're saying, there was a time that a little Havana was, I would say, 80% Cuban. That's not the case anymore. As a matter of fact, in a little Havana, the Cubans are a minority now. Usually the last group of immigrants are the ones that go to the little Havana for the same reason that the Cubans established there, even though it's changing, because at the time, little Havana was the less expensive place. That's not the case anymore. Now it's Homestead there. But that transition became important. And through the years, again, as the they were timed the same that when the professional came. It was a very positive, and Americans were impressed that a Cuban that was working as a janitor could do your accounting or help you with your accounting. Wow, those Cubans are fantastic. When we had the Mariel group, coming in, it's not as much that they were not professional, it's just that there was suddenly 100,000 people, 120,000 people coming at once. And at the same time, about 12% were criminals and so on, because Fidel emptied all the prisoners and, well, the cells, and Mazorra, which was the asylum for the insane and so on. So you had times that it was very positive, and you have time that there was, a very negative aspect. There were times in Miami that if you had any association with Cuba, they might set your business on fire or a place a bomb. There was a time that it was hard to tell who was a freedom fighter, which meant a person in Miami trying to either invade Cuba or act to free Cuba, and who was simply a criminal with a gun, trying to extort people and so on. So, we had good moments, we had bad moments. Finally, it began to change. And also, the next bad moment was not as much related with politics. It was more with drugs and everything else. The hijacking of the planes to Cuba, that happened for a while also, where people were afraid to fly because the plane may be hijacked to Cuba. So again, it's a long history, but I think that now it's not as much a Cuban Miami as it is a Latin American Miami, and hopefully it'll get to a point that it will be an international Miami.
I think it's that already, right? I mean, it's that's, I think, the extraordinary thing about Miami. It's this melting pot of different cultures. I wanted to pick up on something which maybe I don't know, through the lens of these photographs. They were absolutely fabulous photographs, Patricia. They were incredibly evocative. So thank you so much for those. But, I got a sense in a way of, it was kind of, there were really old world values there. I don't know, maybe because you look at these cars and things and you associated it, and maybe I have a kind of retro perspective by which I look at it, but there's some real kind of charm there. And just going back to Jaime's question about the kind of things, that the kind of relative violence happening in Miami, I'm thinking of kind of the difference between the states and the neighboring countries. I mean, just got across the border into Canada, and the kind of the gun ownership and the death rate, I think, is completely different. It seemed to me to be a really kind of friendly culture from what I could see, Patricia. I mean, it reminds me of the past. I mean, when I was a student, I would think nothing of kind of hitchhiking. I would never dream of going hitchhiking anymore, especially in the States. It's a different culture in some ways. But, I mean, I just wanted to know what is it like in terms of, let's say, crime and things. Is it a safe country, Cuba? I mean, it looks to me like an old world values. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I can say that I felt very safe growing up. Since I was little, I walk alone to school. I used to go walk, take a bus, take la guagua. We call them camellos because they were so long and big and carry so many people. And, it was very, very safe for me growing up. There are crimes, of course, like in every place. They're muggers, and they're always like some sort of fight somewhere, and that's completely normal. For me, it happens everywhere, but it's not something that I lived constantly or anything like that. And that's the reason why I say that the Cuba I grew up with it was different. It was more about people coming together, helping each other, and and trying to live their lives the best they could, without bringing more problems to themselves than the ones they already had. So if you go to Cuba now and you, as a tourist, and you act and look like a tourist, yes, you might be mugged, in old Havana and so forth, but it's not something that is constant or happens every day or every time or anything like that. If you know people that have gone through Cuba, they will tell you, and maybe they tell you don't go through this town or don't go to this tree or something like that, and try to be around people. But the entire Havana is always full of people at all times. And they say that, New York doesn't sleep and Havana sleeps, but it's not like the entertainment industry is open 24 hours, but people just like to be outside on the streets, en el malecón, in las calles de old Havana. They don't close old Havana, so they might close the places, but there's always people just walking around and having a nice time. So me growing up, honestly, I was never mugged. I was never, in a crime or anything like that. And I felt it was a safe place. Also, since it's so dense and population and so forth, almost everybody knows each other. And everybody from your block or a couple of blocks, in any direction, they would know you because all the kids were on the streets, and the parents would make sure that the kids were all right, and you would learn to live in a community that kind of knew each other, and that made it that much safer. And so, yes, there is crime like in every place, but it's not abundant.
Maybe I could just ask Marilise to share some, I don't want to say reminiscences, but just the story of her family and how she came to come to the States, because Marilise is also from Cuba. Marilise.
Sure. No, I was going to say, if you're asking me about crime in Havana, I'm not sure that I am in any way able to respond in any, certainly not as Patricia would. My story, of course, Miami, I think, as you said at the beginning in your introductory remarks, and as I suspect all of your students have gathered after listening to all of these Friday conversations about the city from myriad perspectives, is in so many ways a city of immigrants. Just by numbers, probably the Cuban migration, voluntary, involuntary, and we could talk about that for a long, long period of time, certainly outnumbers any other in the city. But you could probably have a really productive conversation and another week's time about being Haitian in Miami, or being Venezuelan in Miami, or being Colombian in Miami, or, you fill in the blank. Miami is nuanced by all of those identities. Jaime's laughing, yes.
Yes.
They are very different.
I agree.
No, they're very different perspectives on the city. And I appreciate that you have gathered, you've created a group of us who left the country at different times and arrived in Miami under different circumstances. It's still anecdotal, right? The perspectives of 4 individuals, but I'm happy to share my own story. I will say that I left the island when I was very, very young, a really tiny child. The revolution took place when my parents had just had their children. I have a brother who was also born right before the revolution, and they were in their 20s, and they were idealistic, incredibly idealistic. They were not enamored of the regime that Mr. Castro's revolution replaced. You can easily argue that the cure was worse than the disease by some substantial measure, but things were not ideal even then. My dad had studied architecture, had begun a practice that did some extraordinary work in the island, in the city of Havana, but also in the greater country. A lot of the work that gets published about mid-century modernism in Havana, he was responsible, he and his partner, Cañas Abril, were responsible for a lot of it. And it was something that they loved. Architects had a history at the University of Havana for being politically active, and they had a lot of opinions about the revolution, about the regime that it was supplanting, and how they were hoping to be sort of critical to the building of a new society, and to doing it both literally and figuratively. And I would say that while my dad was never a political activist, he and my mom were very idealistic and had hoped for better things. So when many of their compatriots, the people in their generation and older generations left the island, they chose to stay. My dad closed his practice because it was one of those things that was a requisite part of the revolution. He went to work in his capacity as a designer and builder to do what he could do to help. They placed him in charge of public works for part of the island, ultimately for the entire island, all of the infrastructure projects and all of the public works things. He ran them for a number of years under the revolutionary government. And over time, right, as all of our relatives and all of our friends and everyone that they knew left, the family became more and more disillusioned with what the new regime was bringing to Cuba. And they started looking for other ways to leave. There weren't many by that time. Diplomatic relations with the United States had deteriorated to such a point that direct migration to the US was out of the question. It was an issue of applying for visas anywhere they could. And my dad explained to his bosses that he was leaving, at which point he was asked to just go. And I think they spent the better part of a year waiting for a visa to come through. And it did finally. They tried through Italy, they tried through Venezuela, they tried through Spain, they tried through Israel, and it was the Israeli visa that came through first, and that's where they headed out. It was a legal migration, but not an easy one. Like all of the stories you've heard, they left everything behind. They left with nothing. They were literally, we were strip searched at the airport to make sure that no one was taking anything that we weren't allowed to take, and with no money in their pockets, they left. They got on an airplane that left the island by way of first Canada and then Czechoslovakia, at which point they were told that they had no connecting flight to Tel Aviv, and that they were going to have to go back to Cuba. And my grandmother was with us at the time. We had lost my grandfather in the wait to leave the island. She went to the French embassy in Czechoslovakia, made a big fuss, and they let us on the next flight out. I think my dad nearly had a heart attack. We've heard lots of stories about this over the years. And the family lived in Israel for another several years before joining family in the United States. I had an uncle who was in Delaware, in Wilmington, that we've been hearing so much about because Mr. Biden is from Wilmington. It's very funny to turn on the television and see the place where I spent 8 years of my childhood that nobody had ever heard of before, all of a sudden be all over the news. And it was still early years in immigrations outside of these sort of border towns. I don't think anyone in my elementary school had ever heard of Cuba, let alone know what a Cuban looked like or sounded like. And, we were asked things like, do they go to the bathroom like other people? It was one of those sort of immigrant crazinesses. And we were there for a number of years before the family moved. I was in high school by then to Miami. And so it was a long time around. By the time I got to Miami, my English was better than my Spanish, and it was already my English was my fourth language. And so it was, one of those strange immigration things. It was easier. My dad became a registered architect in Wilmington, Delaware, as he had become in Israel and as he obviously was in Cuba. So he's had the difficulty of starting over many times. And as part of an immigrant family, that became our story too. Florida, even in those years, was not accustomed to a lot of immigration, although Miami was, you have been or you will be talking about flooding in Miami, environmental flooding. But the reality is that the city of Miami has been flooded by all kinds of things, immigration being one of them. And it certainly had been flooded by a Cuban migration, exile, / for a number of years. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans over time had flooded Miami. But even in that context, the state of Florida, in Tallahassee, which is a different country than Miami, as I think you've heard from others who presented to you, we're not willing to say that an architectural education at the University of Havana was sufficient for registration and licensure in the United States. So despite having an NCARB certificate and licensing exam taken in Wilmington, Delaware, which was just literally up the street, they wouldn't do the sort of reciprocity that allowed my dad to be registered as an architect in Florida for a number of years until someone took them to court. And then everyone had to comply. But we moved here when I was finishing high school. I left not long after to go to college and then to go to graduate school, came back when I finished MIT. But the fact that Dad had come back to a place that had a sort of critical mass of people, many of whom had been his clients when he was in Cuba many years before, allowed him to start a practice again, first as a general contractor, and then as a design builder, then as an architect. And it made it possible and became possible for me to think that this would be a way that I would want to spend my career as well. I think I saw the world through his eyes as I was growing up. I thought that the perspective of an architect, a designer, a thinker, a maker was a brilliant way to address the world and to be in it. It became my way of coming into the world, and it was one that I value greatly. And I lost my dad about 2 months ago, the end of January. So this is a little bit raw, and I apologize for that. But it was a life well lived, and in a profession that he loved dearly and was happy to have been a part of in many countries and under many circumstances. It isn't exactly the story about being a Cuban in Miami or Miami Cuban, but it really is, because it is so much the experience of living in this city. You come at it with all kinds of sort of cultural and personal baggage, if you will, and with an incredible amount of hope and aspiration, and with tremendous dreams. And if you are an architect as well as an immigrant or a migrant or an exile, then you feel that you have tools at your disposal that can help you to make place. And to build the city. And I think that whether you do it from the point of view of the academy, which is the one that I have taken on more fully in the recent years, or whether you do it from the perspective of the person who designs and who builds, I think that there are tremendous opportunities here. And it's one of the Miami is project. Is something that's been very much at the center of my thinking and my living for many years. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's great, Maurice. Can I just ask you one quick question? Because I mean, what was interesting about Patricia's presentation was that and she was showing the cathedral, Catholic churches and things, and of course most communist countries, former communist countries I've been to, well, the religion was not there at all. No, but you actually come from a you're back you got brought up in a Jewish family, and I mean we had this kind of perception, I guess, of Cuba as very Catholic and so on. And but clearly the Jewish diaspora has got all over the world. So I'm just intrigued to how your family ended up in Cuba in the first place.
Okay, those were the migrations of the previous century, right? So not the 20th century migrations, but the late 19th, the very early 20th century migrations. And there was, it probably isn't anymore, a big Jewish community in Cuba, certainly up until the revolution and less after. My family comes from half from Eastern Europe and half from Turkey. My grandmother, all of my mother's side of the family was born in Turkey, in and outside of Istanbul and Edirne on the border. They grew up in French-speaking, before the Ataturk, right? French-speaking families, and Ladino was the sort of migrants' language of choice for that side of the family. And I think the family wandered and decided to have one brother. Of these families are very big, right? 8, 9, 10 brothers and sisters, and one took off and decided to see the world in one of the sort of world tour things, and landed in Cuba and fell in love with the island and decided to stay, and somehow drew the remainder of the family to stay there. And my grandmother got to Cuba as a teenager and grew up and married her husband, who also had come to Cuba by happenstance and decided to stay. And that was that side of the family. My father's side of the family came from the Ukraine. While it was still, well, when it was the Ukraine. And they, and probably before that, Poland. But certainly in the years that my family became the family that I have history of, it was there. And another large family that left the Ukraine through Europe, migrated to the Americas. Part of my grandfather's family made it to the US, and the other part could not, and made it to the next closest place, and that was Cuba. And my father grew up in Cuba. I think he was born in the Ukraine and he arrived in Cuba when he was 2. So my mother was born in Cuba. My father arrived, and he was part of that entire migration. Cuba had communities of Lebanese Christians, of Muslims, of Jews, as well as of Christians of all stripes, the vast majority of whom were Catholic, absolutely, and still are. But yes, we're part of a plethora of religious persuasions on the island. There is all stuff in the chat. What's going on?
Okay, so I mean, I mean, we have to shut down in 5 minutes, but I just want to hear if we got any other questions from the audience. This has been fascinating, I must say. Thank you, Marinice. That was, you know, I also have kind of a strange way. I have this kind of long history. Well, everybody does, of course, but my grandmother came out of Ireland and never went back. She married a British soldier, which is the worst thing you could do, I guess, in Ireland at the time, and never went back. But you know, and the kind of mix of these things, and we were all kind of, you know, we're all a mixture of different kind of backgrounds, and yours is particularly fascinating.
Happy to help. This has been fun. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear that, and I just think it's a kind of, in some ways, Miami is a kind of microcosm of the States in more ways than one. You know, we're all immigrants in different sort of way. I'm still a British citizen, but yeah, it's interesting.
And the U.S. and Cuba have had relations of one sort or another, not always amicable, for many, many years. It's a history that's longer in its arc than the lifetime of any of the people who've been part of this conversation, for certain, and certainly sets the prelude and the stage for everything that's happened since.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Good.
Okay, well let's close things up. Just to say, I wanted to thank. I mean, it's wonderful to hear the stories of everyone, especially Patricia's. Very beautiful story. And next week we'll be hearing more about Latin, like Miami as a kind of capital of Latin America, which is what it makes it so extraordinary and so otherworldly. You know, when I land in Miami and arrive and literally, I hope people realize this is that you can go to certain parts of Miami and, you know, back from Miami Beach, where, you know, this is kind of glamorous international sort of world. There's another world. In fact, Miami is the fourth poorest city in the States, Cali Ocho and the sort of areas way back, where really there is no English spoken. I mean, you can go into a supermarket, a store, and speak English, and nobody understands you, which makes it all the more exotic and special. I always feel like I'm in a kind of Caribbean island or something, partly because of the palm trees and the heat and the kind of the beaches and the Spanish language. It's a beautiful experience.
It is.
So let's go and close down. And look forward to